Well, I'm going to welcome you all here. We're going to get going. We're on schedule, and I have the fortune of being able to introduce Chuck here, Chuck Piper, our next speaker. And Chuck, actually, I have the info that you can read about Chuck on the website. So instead of doing a formal introduction, I'm going to tell you how I met Chuck, which was I first met Bill Colburn doing sugar rockets, and we said, wow, we've got this project called 99K, a precursor to the Google rocket, which Dave was on. And we need to burn an N motor and a P motor, and we don't know where we can burn those motors. Oh, we know this place called Rocket Ranch. And so Bill was kind enough to give me Chuck's phone number, and Chuck was very kind to allow us to do some test burns of our motor at his place. And ever since, we were fortunate enough to see Chuck's show, but Chuck is a rocketeer that has been doing this when we were pretty young. And Chuck was flying rockets to 100,000 feet when we were probably, well, I think I was 9, 10, and Chuck was, 17 years old. So it did happen long before the flight we had last year. And with that, I would like to introduce Chuck.
Can everybody hear me? I guess they can. Okay, thank you. My name's Chuck Piper. This is my wife Claire. We live at the Rocket Ranch. Been doing this since the mid-1950s when I was fascinated by early TV shows, reruns of Flash Gordon on TV, Commando Cody flying across the TV screen, and Walt Disney did a presentation about man in space, and there was a bunch of other articles written about it, and I decided, gee, instead of doing astronomy, which is what I was interested in at the time, I thought it would be a good idea, instead of looking at the stars, how about going to the stars? That would be really neat. I mean, they do it on TV and in the old movies, so why not me? So one day my uncle, who was on active duty in the Navy, came home with a chemistry set. And in those days you could buy chemistry sets with all the dangerous goodies in them. And so we started out by making, our first reaction was to make some black powder using the formula. And it didn't work at all like the black powder my uncle and I had seen before. It came out of fireworks. It just sort of sat there and fizzed. But we learned later that we didn't know what we were doing. And the instructions in the Gilbert Chemistry Set Manual weren't terribly extensive on how to do this. So then we decided that we would make some nitroglycerin, and that worked fine. We survived and took the rest of it and flushed it down the toilet. And then for a period, my folks basically said, we think before you get started on this, that perhaps you do some reading and do some research. So they got me an Encyclopedia Britannica, and when I went to school, I went to the library and found this book called The Boy's Book of Rockets by Raymond F. Yates. It was written in 1947, basically telling how black powder was crammed into all sorts of different types of containers to make all sorts of different kinds of rockets. And so I started doing that. Of course, the people at the gun shop didn't really like selling me the black powder. They said I had to be at least 14 before they'd sell it to me. So I went to the local pharmacy, and because the Gilbert chemistry set didn't have they had the right chemicals, you could buy anything you wanted, but just not in the quantities. I went to a place in Oakland called Chemicals and Supplies, and the guy said, well, you know, basically we just sell nitric acid. That's not going to help you much. He says, there is a place here you can go, and it's like, we have 100-pound containers of potassium nitrate we can sell you. It's like, well, so anyway, spent a lot of time, and I got a book entitled How to Build Model Missiles by a place called Central Rocket Company in Waupaca, Wisconsin. And through Popular Mechanics magazine and Popular Science magazine, you could send away and get all sorts of dangerous chemicals, and would be delivered right to your doorstep by U.S. mail. Of course, that changed. Anyway, so I started making black powder rockets. Made a lot of black powder rockets, and I don't have any pictures of those because at the age of 10 I didn't have any photographic equipment, and my folks basically were not eager to document this because they were hoping that it was just a passing phase. And well, it wasn't. So after I'd gone as far as I could making black powder rockets, having varying degrees of success. About that time, I went into high school and I did a science fair project on rockets using the newly discovered propellant that I had read about called micrograin, which is a mixture of zinc dust and sulfur. And I had a science fair project entitled How Does Grain Configuration Affect the Internal Ballistics of Solid Propellant Rockets? And the principal of the high school said, you know, based on our previous knowledge of your exploits at the intermediate school where you blew out 3 windows, we're not going to sponsor your project. We will allow you to do it, but you're on your own. So I did the project. And there was not much hope for it. But one afternoon, I was called up to the principal's office, and I said, am I in some sort of trouble? And they said, well, the people from Chemical Rubber Company were just here and just presented us with a check for $1,000 because your project won first prize in the 12th grade Bay Area Science Fair Physical Sciences. And we're looking very foolish right about now, and we're sort of, you know, begging your forgiveness. And I said, well, that's okay. And so I got, as part of my prize, I got to have lunch with Dr. William Pickering of the, unlike Homer Hickam, I didn't get to have dinner with Dr. Von Braun or meet Dr. Von Braun. But I did get Dr. William Pickering and another person who came along and simply introduced himself as Jim Van Allen. And they basically said, well, you know, we're really impressed with your work, Charles. Why don't you go see if you can't go to college? We suggest maybe University of California at Berkeley. And once you get your PhD, come back and talk to us. So forget about this rocket nonsense. But we should, once you get done, if you're still alive, we'll have a job waiting for you. Well, instead I got a phone call from a gentleman named George James of the Rocket Research Institute who said, gee, you're interested in building rockets? We build rockets. So this picture that you see up there is going to be the beginning of the slideshow. This is one of the rockets that was left over from my science fair project. It used a micrograin propellant that was castable, and we're going to go ahead and do a presentation of about 25 slides on micrograin rockets because these were early Bay Area rockets. Okay, next. We had to use commonly available materials, like this is a 6-foot long aluminum shower curtain rod, and the micrograin was packed in tissue paper capsules and stacked end to end, much like those cartridges you see up there on the table, except they didn't contain HTPB propellant, they contained micrograin. And I'll go ahead and do the next one. Incredibly, they worked. These particular rockets would travel about a mile. And we called it the Miler, and it was actually named after Dr. Goddard because he was one of George James's inspirations. Okay, go on to the next one. We also decided it would be nice to test the rockets before driving all the way out to the Nevada desert. So we set up a place in Sacramento for testing these. Okay, next. And we came up with a shorter version of the aluminum shower curtain rocket, which would go about 2,500 feet, and we built the static test stand for testing these things. We had actual electronic instrumentation, and it was kind of unusual because the thrust time curves looked more like a polygraph than the classical textbook rocket firing. But after we did over 100 of these, we started going back up to the Nevada desert again and comparing the predicted performance with real performance, and boy, were we shocked. Okay, next. There's a picture of our early test stand. Next. There's a picture of the crew. Unfortunately, the rocket is obscured, but there's a picture of the rocket firing. And after this, we decided that it would be nice to build bigger rockets. Well, we didn't know what to do, but fortunately someone else did. The Army Missile and Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, basically designed a rocket called the Beta rocket, and in the rocket handbook for rocket manual for amateurs, they really touted, gee, if you build this rocket, it'll go 25,000 feet, and you can make it for under $100 next. So we tested that one too. And we also flew a bunch more. We found another launching site near a place called Lahontan Reservoir, and we used that for about 2 years. These pictures that you're about to see were shot in 1967. Okay, next. I'll just wait. Yeah, that probably ought to be a little better. Okay, so we'll go ahead and ripple off about 3 or 4 of these. Now there's another, and we actually were able to recover some by parachute. These would typically go up about a mile. This is what we call a super beta. Instead of being 2 inches in diameter, it was 3 inches in diameter. Unfortunately, sometimes the parachute did not deploy. Next.
How were you doing time delays and parachute charges?
Electronic timers and ordinary time fuses. There's one fellow named Steve Post that developed what he called the self-integrating accelerometer that was also used for deploying parachutes, where it would integrate the thrust time curve and acceleration time curve, and it was hooked up to a small electronic timer powered by battery that fired a squib that blew the parachute out. That one didn't work. There's another one of the Beta rockets. That's George James's dad. He was at 75 years old when that picture was taken. Okay, and it was becoming obvious that the steel rockets just weren't going to give us the type of performance we wanted, so I decided, gee, everybody in the industry, and rocket industry, is switching to monofilament fiberglass. Why don't I start making some rockets out of fiberglass? So we made our own motor cases out of fiberglass with fins very similar to the ones that you see on Ken Beaver's rocket there, that are essentially molded in place. And we did that on the micrograin rockets. Go ahead. And we actually had successful parachute recovery of these. And even when you didn't have a successful parachute recovery, they only when there was usually always enough sticking out of the ground to be able to pull it out and find it, yeah. And there's successful parachute recovery. And there I am with my antique 8mm movie camera. Next. We had some pretty good rocket launchers that we built in those days with rails. We found out that it was nice to have these, but because there were very few pickup trucks at the time, this thing had to be lugged up to the desert on the tops of people's cars, and it just didn't work out too well. So we decided we got to find a better way of doing this.
Why didn't you launch vertically?
Normally, it was a safety factor. We did launch vertically sometimes, but in this particular instance, there was wind, and we wanted to compensate for windage. We didn't want the rockets to come down anywhere near where we were. These were not cardboard rockets, and you notice pictures of high power and model rocket meets where people are rushing out with their hands open to catch the rocket that's coming down with a parachute. And even though many of these came down with a parachute, you wouldn't want to be out rushing out with arms outstretched to try and catch it, because they were a little heavier than the normal model rocket of the day. In fact, at this particular point in time, there weren't too many model rockets. If you look at this particular rocket here, this is a two-stage micrograin rocket, except the upper stage is, in fact, an Estes model rocket. It was launched on top of, Harry Stein was not terribly impressed with that design. He said there were one too many rocket motors. Anyway, so we built about 10 of these Goddard rockets, the micrograin rockets. And these would typically go 10 to 12,000 feet, as opposed to the shorter Milo rockets, which they didn't have a nozzle. They would only go about a mile, and these would go anywhere from 10 to 15,000 feet. Okay, next. No, there's another picture of one. A lot of these look similar, although they're not the same. They were just painted the same. And like I said, building these launchers was quite a task. Okay, next. And there's another picture. Yeah, I think there's two more like that. Go ahead. And then there's a picture.
Is that Smoke Creek or where?
This is Smoke Creek, yeah. The Lahontan site became unusable because the Federal Aviation Agency told us in 1967 that they had gotten kind of some complaints from the Navy at Fallon Naval Air Station, and they asked us, would you please mind moving somewhere else? And we said, well, where would we go? And they said, well, there's this place north of Reno called the Smoke Creek Desert. He says, it's kind of like going to hell, but it would be fine with us if you went there. The smoke, that's the Smoke Creek Desert, I mean. So this is a typical, this is where the term shovel recovery was coined. Okay, and we have another one. And there's a picture of it taking off, and another. And these last shots that you saw, since we had already perfected the parachute, these shots were basically non-parachute recovery, because the objective was not to recover the rocket. The objective was to test bulk modification of various propellant loads, where We would take the micrograin propellant. Some of them were, the capsules were loaded into the rocket. Some of them, the powder was merely loaded in and tamped. And then in other ones, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Ed Dwyer came up with a concept whereby you would take cereals like Rice Krispies and Kellogg's Corn Flakes and even Purina Cat Chow and mix it with the micrograin to keep it from packing so that you could still have a high burn rate without sacrificing specific impulse. Of course, the 90-second predicted specific impulse that was touted in Brinley's book basically was more like 20 seconds. And the statement that a properly designed amateur rocket could reach an altitude of 100,000 feet using micrograin propellant proved to be true. The only thing is that they didn't tell you that the rocket would have to be essentially the size of the Washington Monument to do that. So we could see where this was going nowhere fast. Towards the end of the micrograin era, we built some very large micrograin rockets because there were people that wanted to fly mail in them. Now, I'm not sure why. It was not one of my favorite pastimes, but we had to design and build some very large micrograin rockets. We called them mail rockets or cargo rockets, and we'll show you some pictures of those right now. We'll just kind of burn through these kind of quickly. They were typically 3 inches in diameter and about 16 to 18 feet long, used 200 pounds of micrograin and carried the mail on the fins. Okay. And there we are putting on together at a place called Lake Winnemucca, Nevada. We did this for the Paiute Indians as part of their Save Pyramid Lake fundraiser. Okay, next. There we are installing the nozzle. Okay. There's that night it snowed and everything was white. And when we went to fire the rocket, all we saw was a great big giant fireball. We didn't find the rocket till the next day. Next. And then as part of our ongoing commitment to what we call astrophilatelic collectors, we were asked to launch some rockets in New Mexico. And this particular flight took place at a place called the Mescalero Ranch, which is where Dr. Robert Goddard did all of his initial flight work. And so this woman came out, the one in the hard hat there with the blue dress, and I talked to her and she said, yes, you know, Bob and I used to come out here all the time and launch rockets. Bob? He says, oh yes, I'm Esther Goddard and I'm here to launch your rocket for you. And so she did, and the next picture shows the rocket taking off at Mescalero Ranch. Didn't go very far because there was a launcher issue. But it did go. This was taken in the Smoke Creek Desert, and we launched this rocket right down the main road. The reason why is because it had rained a couple nights before, and we knew that we couldn't get it. These typically would go about 2.5 miles, okay? And here's a picture of it taking off. They're truly amazing because you can truthfully say that one of the things about the micrograin rockets is that almost as much propellant gets burned outside of the rocket as gets burned inside the rocket, which is why you have, I mean, they're very spectacular, but I'm afraid that Peter Pan will fly higher.
Why are they always so long and thin, I suppose?
Because of the burn time issue, in order to get enough propellant in there, the burn rate of the propellant can vary up as high as 3 to 5 feet a second. So that's why. And if you pack it real tight, sometimes it'll burn in inches per second. It's a very unpredictable propellant. It's just basically, the only thing thing it's good for is for demonstrating physical properties and for demonstrating propulsion principles. It definitely does not fit the textbook example of what a solid propellant should be. And I'm glad we don't use it anymore.
They're pretty.
They're pretty. I have been asked on several occasions if for old time's sake we wouldn't make one, and I said, you know, I don't think so. Okay, it's not a safety issue, it's just, you know, we never had a problem with micrograin as far as safety.
Isn't it subject like to static or ignition?
Yeah, we did static tests too. Like I said, it's the static tests with, oh, there are electrostatic sensitivity
Yeah,
issues with it.
like, yeah, right.
But it's not like a lot of the other pyrotechnic mixes. Takes quite the electrostatic threshold. I forget how many joules it is, but it's pretty high. You really have to do something stupid to have micrograin go off. Normally, the micrograin accidents that have occurred have not occurred from ESD, but have occurred because something got spilled and it found an ignition source, like, you know, somebody doing it in their garage next to the hot water heater. That there have been accidents. Somebody had a bag, a plastic baggie, and they were hauling it through their house, and somehow it went off, and the guy got second and third degree burns. And a couple of years ago, some guy up near Sacramento got burned fatally with it. So I just don't even want to go there anymore. Well, anyway, we turned this program over to some high school students up in Oregon, and they worked with it, and they didn't like it either. So they said, Chuck, you got to give us some better stuff to work with. So at that time, we decided, yeah, just go ahead and show, just,
Micrograin.
yeah.
Okay, that's
That's
the end of the micrograin.
the end of the micrograin presentation, and the next thing we decided was that we needed something a lot better, something that fit the textbook better that we could work with. And so at the time, the gentleman there standing next to that thing that looks like a lunar lander is George James and the rest of the people, and they developed a mixer for melting potassium perchlorate in asphalt. We had originally thought we were going to use potassium nitrate and sugar, but George, having worked with Dr. Von Karman and Molina and other people at JPL, was able to get a hold of a lot of the technical information on making asphalt perchlorate propellant, and so it was his decision to go ahead and do that rather than using the nitrate and sugar. So I had to get rid of a lot of potassium nitrate. I was upset. I still remind him of that. But the asphalt perchlorate was basically cast into tubes that were 3 to 5 inches in diameter. We found that smaller rocket motors just simply, it was non-scalable. It didn't work because of issues with the liner and the propellant diameter of the charge and what's known as a KM ratio. It was yielded unpredictable results. So when we got to 5 inches, the problem went away. And in the early ones, as you can see, we used solid copper nozzles because that way we could compare it with the baseline of the what they call the Parsons rocket that was developed by John W. Parsons and his team at Caltech, because we had all the data and we just wanted to make sure that our data correlated with their data, and sure enough, it did. We got nice, really nice looking time curves. So we built these 5-inch diameter rockets that contained about 35 pounds of propellant, and we had fairly good luck with them. Want to show the next one?
Sure.
These typically produced a very white, smoky exhaust, 380 pounds of thrust, 10-second burn time. Next. And we used ordinary black powder to ignite the surface. Next. Originally, we called this rocket the Tar Baby, but for certain other considerations, that name was changed to SR-1 for Sustainer Rocket. And there's a picture of it in the test stand. And as it turns out, we never actually fired this particular motor. We were going to use it as part of a launch, and then we discovered that we were going to have a much longer launcher than you would normally use. So we took it, go ahead and show them a picture of it. We had this really long launcher, and we were going to launch it, and well, you can see in the next few slides what happened. This particular propellant has an extreme disadvantage that it doesn't like to be used at temperatures below 38 degrees Fahrenheit because of a phenomenon known as the glass transition phase, where the asphalt cracks. Now, everything that you've probably heard about rocket motor cases made out of steel fragmenting into many jagged pieces and flying everywhere are simply not true. This is not, I can show you dozens of exploded rockets made out of steel, but unfortunately, steel nowadays in various circles is frowned on. In fact, Tripoli has a prohibition of steel motor cases. So, well, what can I say?
What was the oxidizer?
Potassium perchlorate. Okay, there's a picture of one of the chunks of propellant. Next. So we decided that, gee, the end burner wasn't going to work for us, so we needed a rocket motor that would burn the propellant very quickly. So one of my friends and I developed a graphical program and even had a computer program to predict the way this should be done, and we came up with this hybrid mandrel made out of wood and aluminum for pouring the propellant around. Next. Well, unfortunately, the propellant wouldn't flow around the mandrel because it cooled down before it would do that. So we essentially came up with a process where the mandrel was essentially pushed into the molten propellant using a process called displacement casting or in-place extrusion. Next. And there's a picture of the propellant grain after it's been removed. It was also not really easy to get it out of there once it cooled down, but car jack did wonders. Okay, next. And we developed various igniters for firing these. This was a foam igniter made out of potassium perchlorate, polyurethane, and aluminum powder, fired with an ordinary squib, and we did a bunch of tests at cold temperature in the desert to see whether it would work or not. And we have like 3 or 4 slides of that. Just go ahead and burn through those real quick. Okay, that one flew. We had several explode. We decided after that that particular ignition method just simply wasn't working. Just wasn't reliable enough. So we came up with ignition pellets made out of potassium perchlorate and aluminum powder that burned at about 2,700 calories per gram, which is at that time almost the hottest material that you could get. And there were several people in the group who worked at a company called Burmite that made this for a living, so they taught me how to make it, and so we used this from there on to ignite the asphalt perchlorate propellant because it was hard to ignite. It was very difficult to ignite. Okay, next we have pictures of these various nozzles. This nozzle was a nozzle that came from the 5-inch high velocity aircraft rocket that we were able to get a substantial supply of. A fellow down in Turlock, California had a surplus yard and he sold us these. We bought 500 of them. It was kind of pricey. We had to pay almost $4 a piece for them, and the head caps were, he said, they're extra. They're $1.50 each, and so we wound up with these. He had purchased the entire U.S. inventory from the Navy Hawthorne Army plant, Army depot, and they were getting rid of all of them. So I think he paid like 50 cents a piece for these rocket motors, and so even at that ridiculously low price, he came out okay, and we got the deal of the century, and we used these for almost 25 years, and I still have some left. Anyway, this is where the concept that you probably heard of the Medusa nozzle, I think this may have inspired it. Okay, next. There's another picture of the nozzle assembly with igniter. And one of the things that we were able to do is finally with this high acceleration rocket motor, we were able to reduce the size of the rocket launcher to something that would fit in the back of a Volkswagen. And these rockets would accelerate so rapidly that they only needed to be held in place for about 3 inches. And once they moved 3 inches, they were on their own. Okay, next. This is one of the first rockets that we launched as a single stage rocket. This is a camera rocket. Sticking out of the side of that rocket there, halfway up the white section, is an 8mm movie camera that I put in there. And we took some excellent pictures of the Empire gypsum line through that camera. And oddly enough, we recovered it intact. Go ahead and show. There's a picture of the rocket taking off, close up. Another one. There's a picture of the rocket after it was recovered with a parachute. Typical Army olive drab parachute, available on the surplus market for about $1.50. Okay, next. We didn't have an awful lot of money to work with back then, you know, so if you could build a rocket that would go 25,000 feet for under $25, that was a pretty good deal. And so the next one, we developed all sorts of these. We're just going to kind of burn through these because we've got so many of them. Typical single stage rocket, we developed a kit. Next. And we developed a way of using a crane in the back of my old pickup for lifting these things up and putting them on the launcher because typically they weighed anywhere from 85 to 100 pounds loaded. These particular rockets, called BR-1, would go about 25,000 feet. Next. And because of the hazards involved, we had a trench, and we got in the trench, and we were 800 feet away. Some of them we were as far as 1,200 feet away. Next. And then one of the gentlemen by the name of Rick Bennett decided, you know, it's really stupid to take one of these rockets and waste the first 20 inches of it by cutting it off and throwing it away. I'm going to come up with a rocket that uses the complete high bar assembly, and we can put 40 pounds of propellant in it. And we said, okay, go ahead. We'll even give you some motors. So he came up with a rather unique kind of propellant grain design, which wasn't like a star, but it was shaped like a teardrop, and he called it a moon burner. And that's where the moon burner first came into play, was in one of Rick Bennett's asphalt perchlorate rockets. Next. He was also one of the first people to employ using a dart. There's another asphalt perchlorate rocket. Next, taking a different picture at a different angle. Next. And finally, taking it about half a mile away. Another one of the single stage asphalt perchlorate rockets. Next. And another. A lot of people may ask why the steel plate on the ground. Well, if you didn't have the steel plate there with railroad ties underneath it, these things typically generated so much thrust that when they took off, they'd dig a hole about 2 feet in the ground and about 6 feet in diameter. And then you'd have to pick the rocket launcher up and move it to a new location and reset it before you could use it again. We, like the SD's Astron rocket, we also tried our hand at tumble recovery. And there we have, 100-pound tumble recovery rocket by simply blowing one of the fins off with a piece of primacord. There's another picture taken off.
That explains the long term.
Another picture of the rocket being prepared on the launcher. There's another tumble recovery effort. Some tumble recovery works quite well. And I think one of the next pictures shows you one that didn't. Yeah, that was more like a shovel recovery. The payload actually had an electronic payload, but it was pretty well scrambled. Okay, next. And in 1981, we turned the program over to a group of high school students led by Dr. Leroy Key, who was the superintendent of schools in Whitefish, Montana, and Estacada, Oregon. And his students, we gave them all of the chemicals, we gave them all the rocket motor cases, and of course they had to put them together, and they built these rockets and loaded them and brought them down to the Smoke Creek Desert and launched them, and we helped them with the pyrotechnics and hookup, and here's a couple of rockets that we actually put tracking flares on the fins so that you could track these things to 25,000 feet. Optically, you could actually follow the entire flight of the rocket. It was just a feasibility study that worked quite well, but it wasn't really practical because it was a big hassle to you can see there one of the places where a rocket launcher used to be, and after we've had to fill the hole back in. Okay, next. And there's a picture of it taking off. These rockets typically would go, like I said, about 25,000 feet. That's 20-pound payload, 25,000 feet. We made about, over the years, probably 50 or 60 of these. Okay, next.
What was the liftoff weight?
Typically a little over 100 pounds, 100 to 120 pounds. There's one of the payload sections that they recovered. You have to understand that recovering the rocket back then was not a high priority thing. We didn't put a lot of emphasis on it because when you've got a rocket motor that you probably paid less for than a model rocket kit at the time, you didn't care. It's like, okay, if it goes 20 feet in the ground, who cares? We'll just go get another one. We've got 500 of them, so,
What's the airframe made out of?
4130 steel. Some of them were, you have to understand that in these types of rockets, okay, the rocket motor is the airframe. It's not, you don't load it, cartridge load it like, it's not like loading a model rocket engine into a cardboard tube. The motor itself is backbone of the vehicle. Okay, next. Okay, well, we're gonna burn through it, okay. Let's go ahead and we're just gonna burn through these last slides on here and go right to the 2-stage and 3-stage,
Okay.
okay? Go ahead. Go ahead. That's the Foothill Rocket Team, that's right. Mr. Rocket Golf was involved in this.
83, 84.
Yep.
Altitude 22,080 feet. Altitude travel.
Yep.
That's cool.
After we show these slides, we're gonna show the 2-stage rockets. We basically decided that 25,000 feet wasn't high enough, so we would go ahead. We're gonna go right to the 2-stage one, because we've only got about 15 of those slides. And then I'm gonna show you pictures of a 3-stage rocket launch that was done as part of a feasibility study, just to see if you could go 100,000 feet using 1940s technology. Okay, the rockets grew bigger and more impressive and flew higher. Just go ahead and this was a lot of money was spent making these nozzles. These were not the nozzles that came with a high velocity aircraft rocket. And used the rocket we had talked about before, the SR rocket, which burned for 10 seconds at 380 pounds of thrust, was used as a second stage, and the BR-1 or BR-2 rockets were used as boosters. Next. Okay. Next. They were so heavy, these were over 200 pounds. Next. They also, some of these things had electronic payloads, science payloads, whatever you want to call them. We did spend a lot of time trying to get the first stage of the rocket back because we didn't want to lose that big, beautiful fiberglass nozzle. We didn't care what happened to the second stage or the payload because these are just feasibility studies. Okay, next. And again. And again. And again. And there's a picture of one of the 2-stage rockets going off. These would typically go anywhere from 48 to 55,000 feet. We did have one that went 60,000 feet, we think. We're not absolutely sure about that. They were all tracked optically. They either had smoke flares or flash bombs in them and we had a measured baseline, and we just used something similar to the Estes Alpha scope. It was a crude transit along a measured baseline. And we could get within about 5 or 10% of accuracy. Certainly nothing like GPS. Of course, nobody even knew what GPS was then. Next. There's a successful recovery of the first stage by parachute. Well, I mean, they did go down into the ground about 3 feet, but the important thing is that big nozzle there was saved and could be reused. And the motor cases, being made out of steel, it didn't hurt them a bit. You could just pull them right out, scrape off the mud, and reload them. We even had a hand of making some of the fins out of plywood that worked really well. And there's a picture of one taking off. And there's a picture of the second stage igniting.
Wow, cool.
And next. And there's a picture of the second stage continuing to burn. Like I said, they burnt for about 10 seconds after they separated. Okay, I think that's it for the 2-stage. No, we still have a couple more. We turned this program also over to the students from Estacado, Oregon, and they built their own version of the 2-stage rocket, which worked quite well. Now we're going to show you some slides of our 3-stage experimental rocket that we launched in 1979. This was the first rocket where the FAA ever issued a waiver to go over 100,000 feet. It was not not like it is today. Basically, I called up the FAA and said, I want to waiver to 100,000 feet. And the guy said, oh, okay. Where are you going to do this? And I filled out the forms and submitted it. 2 weeks later, it came back, and I said, don't you want to know anything more about it, like where it's going to come down? No, we don't care. Doesn't matter. It was a totally different world in terms of regulatory oversight. The reason why most of these pictures are taken at night is because the year we were going to launch this rocket, the transmission of my truck went out, and I had to rebuild it at the side of the road at the Southern Pacific Railroad Station in Truckee, California. So we didn't start building the rocket until 9 o'clock at night, and we finished putting it together at 4 in the morning. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of the rocket taking off, but there's a picture of it on the assembly stand at night, working by generator light. Next, which is why the pictures are kind of blurry because the exposure, these are time exposures. We do have a really nice picture of it taken in the daytime though. Next. And there it is. This was featured in several magazine articles. Basically, the long and the short of it, it went around 100,000 feet. It was tracked on radar to 75,000 feet until the radar stopped working. The altitude was verified by flash bombs that were ejected from the side of the rocket every 5 seconds. And these flash bombs are visible in broad daylight at 20 miles range. And so we know, based on the angles that we got from the 2 tracking stations, that we were at least 100,000 feet, but we had no payload other than 10 pounds of wet sand in the nose cone. The first stage was recovered, second stage was recovered, third stage, it's probably still out there somewhere. So that's a 3-stage rocket. We proved the feasibility of building an amateur-built rocket using 1940s technology. And we decided this just isn't feasible on a large scale, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to build a modern rocket using modern propellant. So we do have a slide here, about 3 or 4 slides of some of the what we call HTPB nozzleless rockets, and we have a video. And then I think we're going to be done. We'll have question and answer. Okay, next. Just go to the, one of our members is a fellow by the name of Ray Goodson, who is a propellant chemist at CSD. Ray and I worked. We built many of these nozzleless rockets. We built 3-inch, 4-inch, and 5-inch ones, a total of 50 of these rockets. They were made out of, the first ones are made out of aluminum irrigation tube. And the nozzle, even though we say nozzleless rocket, the nozzle was actually made out of propellant. And, yeah. Okay, we're gonna go right to the video. One of the early people that came up to the desert is Gary Rosenfield, and Gary Rosenfield and some of the other people that used to come up to the desert. Gary brought his camera and recorded this and was nice enough to let us use this for our presentation. Well, we're going to go ahead and show you pictures. We have a 3-inch nozzleless launch and a 5-inch nozzleless launch. The 5-inch one being a lot more spectacular. And it has a soundtrack here. I believe that's Gary talking. Okay,
They're now installing the tail on this rocket, and this is typical of all rockets. The igniter has already been installed, and they're now screwing on the payload section.
that's a young Jerry Irvine talking, if anybody, any of you know who Jerry Irvine
Which
is.
one is Jerry?
Yeah.
Which guy is Jerry?
Ray is now tapping the receptacle for the igniter at the top of the rocket.
1982, folks. Over the years, we've launched roughly 25 rockets. They would typically go anywhere from 30 to 40,000 feet and carry about a 7-pound payload. Hydroxyl terminated polybutadiene and aluminum. In other words, HTPB. Okay, now we have the 5-inch one. We only built one of these.
Double click it.
Double click, and then close that one and double click on the front.
It's down there in the billboard, isn't it?
Thank you.
And there we go. Ray is on the left, I'm in the middle, Ken Mason's at the right.
Yeah, there should be audio.
A lot of early rocket people here in this, in these two videos.
This rocket is being placed in a 20-foot launch.
Gary's doing the narration here. Unfortunately, Ray did not live long enough to see his hopes for this realized. We built got a piece of property, and we were gonna set up a place to manufacture these and make them available for all sorts of programs, and unfortunately, that didn't come to pass because the regulators got in the way, and Ray couldn't wait, and unfortunately, he passed away. But we do have plans to try and reactivate this program at some point here in the future, right after I retire. So we do have, there are other slides on this video here is available. We have copies here for $25, and then Bill Colburn has some of these for sale in his concession as well. And they're here if you want them. We're going to be doing some upgrading on these things, and there will be some other ones available. I might add that there's also some pictures of the work we did with Evel Knievel on his Sky Cycle, and the late Captain Bob Truax, because they both used our test site in Sacramento for doing their rocket tests. I think that's about all the time we have for as far as showing the slides. So if anybody has any questions.
So where's the place you call Rocket Ranch?
Well, it's near the town of Patterson, California, not too far from here.
Oh, okay, east of,
Yeah, we basically bought an abandoned naval bombing and gunnery range, and we, because of all the rules and regulations and all the stuff we've got, we have to live there. It's not that we want to live there, it's just we don't have any choice. It's either that or nothing, so. And we've run into all sorts of problems with regulators, you know. I could take up 3 hours just talking about that, but nobody wants to hear that anyway. It's more fun to talk about launching rockets, or more fun to talk about rockets that we have launched. Any other questions? I'm gonna be around here all day today, so if I don't answer your question now, you can just grab me or my wife in the hallway. We'll be circulating around. We'll be here to the banquet. Yes,
What kind of ISP did you get out of the asphalt?
186 seconds at 2,700 pounds per square inch pressure. This is not your typical propellant that burns at 1,000. It has a very high burn rate exponent, and it's very well understood, but it's very difficult to live with. Yeah, Doug.
The thrust of the high bar is just only like 8,000 or more. The high bar is a thrust, how much balance is thrust?
What?
The high bar.
Oh, which you want the numbers for the BR1 motor or the BR2?
The booster.
Well, booster is about 7,200 pounds of thrust for 9/10 of a second, 40 pounds of propellant. If you blinked, you might not see it until it was several thousand feet up in the air, and before it burned out, it was already going supersonic.
Chuck, in my last trip to Smoke Creek, just moseying around, I found a BR1. I'll give it to you if you want it.
Oh, okay, sure, we'd like to have it back.
Rusted clear through though.
Yeah. The rocket, the person who's the head of the Tripoli Gerlach group for Tripoli, named Tom Blanzan, refers to the Smoke Creek Desert as the promised land, and that he refers to things that you just found out there called, they're known generically as rocket fossils. And so I've been invited to go back to Smoke Creek because apparently they're going to have I don't know where they came up with the name hamster dance, but they're going to be having a rocket launching there, and he wanted me to come and I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do, but I said I'd show up.
Where your coat at?
Pardon me?
Where your
Well, anyway, if there's...
With that, we've got 3 o'clock, Bill's gonna start or thereabout, and Chuck's gonna be here the rest of the day, so you can talk to him. Why don't you take a 10-minute break and come on back?
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you very much.